Hi there, it's Ron and Cindy Gula with another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Cindy, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing very, very well. So we're recording this in the morning. So we actually have coffee and not
Yay.
bourbon or wine. So it's all good. Welcome to the morning show of Gula Tech Cyber Fiction. Today we're very excited because one of the winners from our very, very first Gula Tech Foundation grant process is here with us today. So Lauren DeWita, the CEO and founder of Girl Security, is joining. Lauren, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you.
Coffee's
Yes,
kicking in.
yes,
Coffee's
yes.
kicking in.
Exactly.
Literally practiced that just before we got on the air.
I've had
How are
my
you?
cups already. I'm doing really well. I'm happy to be with the both of you for this podcast, which is super cool.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today. And we're going to talk a lot about girl security, your background, and you're actually a national security expert. So we're going to talk about that a good bit. But before we get into all that, just how's the reaction been to being an award winner? Have you gained any new followers or,
Yeah.
expanded your world?
Exposure,
Yeah.
impact.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I mean, without the Gula Tech Foundation grant, it just opened so many doors for us, both in terms of what it's enabled us to do from a capacity perspective, but also with respect to support. We've had contact with several folks who have either knew about the award process and the results, or heard us on one of the programs that you've enabled us to be part of. And it's created a really kind of awesome cascading effect of support, both in terms of just direct contacts and social media as well. So it's really transformative for us, because we really are I started the organization in 2016 as a volunteer project. However, we incorporated in 2019. So to some extent, we're in startup mode. But as one person called us, which I took as a high compliment, is we're a very efficient organization. So the grant really has enabled us to take our efficiency and scale it in a way that we're extremely grateful for. So I appreciate it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we're very excited that you got the award, the background, what you actually do. So, with Girl Security and your background, tell us a little bit more of how and why you started Girl Security.
Yeah, it's funny. I was going back into my emails. I actually was emailing with my brother in around 2005, 2006 when he was in Iraq. And I was a national security analyst at the time with a small Chicago-based think tank. And it was really just this realization that I had no idea what national security was, even though I'd studied political science for 4 years. My parents were like, "Why did we send you to college?" I'm a first-gen college grad. And so the basis of the organization, or the idea, was wanting young people to understand what national security decision making looked like. And this was, of course, post 9/11. We were in Iraq, and so I was emailing back and forth with my brother talking about this idea, which he supported. And in fact, at one point I said, "I'd like to do something for women, because there's really nothing for women in national security." And his response was, "I think that's a bad idea." So
Did you lower his voice a little bit when he said that?
it was over email. So now I have proof that I can prove him wrong, which is always, really rewarding. And so I think the idea of having an educational program for kids, for young people, about national security was really the basis of it. And then, of course, being a woman in national security, wanting to focus specifically on girls and women. And then really, I don't love to talk a lot, and I don't really think that young people oftentimes want to hear adults speaking. So I really wanted to create something that was more learning and training based, seeing where, especially in the cybersecurity space, which is where my arrow was pointed early on in my career, seeing kind of the way that the cyber domain was going to change the ways in which we think about national security, the ways in which we live our lives. I really wanted to do something that provided young people with enduring skill sets that they could adapt regardless of how technology would shape our society. And then in 2016, with the election and the kind of emergence of disinformation, I thought, boy, what an opportunity, because after 9/11, everyone wanted to do something, but there were limited things one could do. My brother enlisted, I volunteered, I had my position at a think tank and so forth. But I thought really girls are on the front lines just by being online in this kind of new wave. So it was really an opportune moment to try to start an organization that could both empower girls with learning and training, but also um, create that kind of pipeline and pathways effect that has still been lacking up until starting Girl Security.
So we certainly thought that the national security angle on this was unique, and so did our foundation board, which is, I think, one of the reasons you guys competed so well. But can you take a moment and just define national security? You know, what does Girl Security do with the national security focus? What can you tell people who might not think outside of just the cybersecurity box?
It's really interesting. I mean, the way that we talk about national security and girl security is really question based. So we ask girls what they think national security means to them. And the reason that we chose to do that is because when I first started the organization and I was going across the country purposely working with communities in diverse regions, national security is a very partisan topic when in fact it's the most common purpose. And so the one way in which we wanted to try to dismantle that was to really just invite girls into a conversation about what national security meant to them. And their answers are quite wide ranging. You know, there's the more typical ideas of just keeping the nation safe. But then there's also ideas around access to education and fighting poverty or maternal health. You know, girls kind of have very different ideas about what they think national security should mean. And so really the idea behind our model is to create that space for them to innovate around what national security should mean. And hopefully their innovative ideas can eventually drive, you know, policy and lawmaking in the national security space.
Yeah, no, I really like that approach. And I keep saying again, we need to change the language. We need to make it more approachable. We need to make it more understandable and personal. And I think that's one thing national security and cybersecurity is constantly missing, is
Yeah.
that people don't hear it the way you're saying it. And just the ignorance of not understanding that has really, I think, caused a lot of the backlog or lack of engagement that we need from everybody.
Have,
I agree.
have you heard of there's a tabletop exercise called the National Security Decision Making Game? Our son did it. It's one of these things where you go and you sit down, and you might be the head of the CIA, you might be the head of the Politburo, and everything you're done is through a clean room, like all of your missions and stuff like that. So we did this, well, he did this in 2007, 2008,
Yeah.
all men, all men. So
Oh.
your focus on bringing women into this, how does that change the conversation?
You know, it's really interesting. We're actually building, we've actually built it. We'll be releasing it between the 20th remembrance of 9/11 and International Women's Day, or a Day of the Girl, I mean. And we actually do a national security decision making exercise as part of that. It's a week-long curriculum, 5 days, 1 hour a day, and it's accessible to upper, middle, and high schools. But what's interesting is it's built by women in national security, some of whom have had some of the most pivotal impacts. For example, our board chair, Gina Bennett, who's been in CIA for 30 years, she's most well known for identifying Osama bin Laden. She's built the curriculum. She built the national security decision-making tabletop. And it's interesting because the ways in which she structured the tabletop is so different from other games and simulations that I've seen. It's much more collaborative. It's much more integrative in terms of inviting discourse. It's structured in a way that is not necessarily competitive, but really, we think, leads towards the goal of how do you make national security decisions with limited information and very few good outcomes. And so as part of that, one of our advisors, also Carmen Medina, who is also former CIA, she had previously shared a memo that we will make part of our curriculum, which was a group of women in the IC who were asked to interpret post 9/11 through the lens of women. And it's so fascinating to me because I think we, from a public facing perspective, women's contributions have not been highlighted, in fact, have been marginalized. And so our approach is really, what does that what does national security look like when you see more women, when women are involved in decision making, when they're involved in the operational and logistical and strategic aspects? They're already there, but we're not able to see and really value their contributions unless it's through this kind of subtle shared way. And so I think that curriculum will provide an opportunity, especially for girls, to see how that collaborative take on national security decision making can actually shape outcomes in a way that are very different from what we've seen. And we just haven't seen that yet. And I'm hopeful for it.
Yeah, again, the industry, most people in the industry are told, don't tell what you do, don't talk
Yeah.
about it. It's a secret, it's a secret. And so there is already this big area of not telling what you do. Therefore, how are you supposed to tell people what
Yeah.
we do and what it's like and everything? So we're really, again, with this show and other ways, trying to make sure we encourage people to talk about that. But could you give us some, I guess, experience when you told people your path and those women look at you and it's like you're talking a different language. They have no way of seeing your path to understand it, to make it to them. But then how do you get them to step forward and say, oh, it's not what I thought?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And one of the things that frankly concerned me when I started Girl Security is I didn't want girls to be pigeonholed into one area of national security because most women move between areas. Suzanne Spalding, who was my mentor, who's on our board, started out in nonproliferation and nuclear security, and then moved into cyber and moved into CIA and intelligence. So someone again recently said, it's great that you've achieved that ubiquity of not being pigeonholed because the national security field is quite elusive to girls. They don't see pathways outside of military and intelligence. Cyber is more prominent, but they still don't know what that means for them. And so what we really try to do is the first thing they see is a series of supportive women who've served in some capacity in the field. Then they kind of go through a training piece where they realize they already have the skills that they need, critical thinking, ethics, collaboration. These are skills for a future workforce that we talk about. So it's very multidisciplinary. We don't try to set them in one path. But then once they're paired with a mentor, or they're secured with an internship, or they have an opportunity to work on a capstone, they realize that any of their interests are really national security interests, whether it's human rights or emerging tech or nuclear weapons. We actually just did this kind of word bubble representation of what our mentees' interests are, and they're very vast, but they're all national security. And so our way of approaching it is really just to create that space for them to explore. Once they've explored, they have the skills that they need, and then they have the supportive community and the social networks to advance and create opportunities for themselves.
Yeah, and your organization on your website, you say you use the C approach
Yeah.
and, securing, empowering, and advancing. And is this, tell us a little bit more of the process or any resistance that you might see from people going through this.
Yeah, I mean, that is the C model was kind of this. I realized when I created it, I guess it has an acronym. Someone suggested we should add an L for lead, but I thought SEAL might be too on the nose. So I do think it's this idea of, and as Suzanne mentioned on a podcast the other day, that we're not just creating the pipeline, we're also empowering girls civically, which is a big part of it. Is I personally have felt that I didn't want girls to not come into Girl Security because they don't necessarily see a pathway, because their civic engagement, their civic understanding of how they may vote or be involved locally, given how national security is quite local and global. We wanted to have that civic benefit. So when we work in schools with schools, it really is designed to just open their eyes to national security, because oftentimes in high school civics and history courses, they're not teaching modern history. And they really struggle to talk about 9/11 because it was this very distinct modern national security incident that was unlike what young people at the time saw. And I think adults were struggling to make sense of. So the first piece is really just getting them to think about what national security means within a history and civics context. And then once they're interested, because they always have a very specific interest, counterterrorism, you know, biodefense, cyber, whatever it might be, once they step into that space and they develop the skill set that they need, then they feel empowered to pursue the pathways. Because again, through the mentoring program, they're able to be surrounded by a team of supportive women who really are also purpose driven and want to see them thrive and not have to confront some of the same impediments that they had to when they were moving throughout their careers. And I think in terms of resistance, I think I don't even know if I'd call it resistance, but when we first did a war game that was covered by NPR, we got a lot of feedback, mostly positive, but there was feedback about militarizing girls and things like that, which wargaming is such an important tool. It's such an important learning tool. And so I think to me that reflected societal norms around the role of girls and women in security generally. But also I really try to not sensationalize the idea of like girls in wargaming, because it's girls learning about strategy and planning and logistics, which is something that they do any day. It just happens to be a tool that they can use in their career. So that would probably be what I think was the resistance point.
That's excellent. So how long is the course? What kind of age are you targeting? I mean, you're saying girls, so I'm assuming it's teenagers, that
Yeah.
sort of age group. And then how much cybersecurity do you actually teach in the course?
So the age group is upper high school through early undergrad, but our in-school programming starts in the middle school. And I think cyber is one of the foundational components because we talk about it in the context of domains, of which cyber is one. And then most of the skill sets we're teaching are analytical skill sets that one would use in problem solving and innovating in the kind of tech and society space. So programming's like we do intelligence analysis, we do ethical hacking, we do predictive analysis. Even with respect to law and policy in the cyberspace, we talk about kind of those key tensions around, you know, privacy and information sharing, and how do you kind of move forward mandates or regulations when you're problem solving in this new domain. So I would say cyber is such a core of what we teach because it's integrated into everything that we're talking about, from critical infrastructure to climate change to any of the other national security challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, in language, again, we can't go far enough to say that language really does matter, especially in this area. And for cybersecurity, my argument is to make it more personal and get more people invited in. We should really start calling it data care
I
and
love
really pull people in and say, do you have data that's online that you want to protect? Inevitably, their answer is going to be yes. So come into cybersecurity, help, be your own responsibility and engage. So, how with either data care or other things, what are some barriers that you see maybe getting more women of color in or underserved population? Like how are you addressing that beyond just the already women language barriers?
First of all, I love the data care concept. I think it's so important because I do think it's a far more accessible idea than cybersecurity for the same reasons we were mentioning earlier about the kind of initial reaction one has to the word security, whether it's national security or cybersecurity. And I do think relatedly that historically we've really failed to value the role of the public in national security, which is why I think this is such an important opportunity, this moment in time. I think with respect to girls of color, there's a couple of different challenges, and we see this at the high school level. There's simply a lack of understanding about what pathways look like. We've also had pushback from some about starting in high school as opposed to waiting until college. And to be candid, I think that's a position of privilege, right? Most young people who are in conditions in which it's either unsafe for them to be in school or they have lack of access to an equitable education, they don't have the privilege of going to college and finding their career over the course of 4 years. They need a job. And that's something that resonates with me, but it resonates with a lot of the girls in our program. I think the other part of it is there are associations with security vis-a-vis law enforcement. We talk a lot about, we use equity frameworks. In other words, to simplify that, we come into a room with the understanding that we don't understand everyone's experiences. And so if you have populations of girls specifically who, for example, mentees in our program who may be non-citizens, who are afraid that their parents will be detained by ICE, well, they may not want to have a presenter from the FBI, or they may have an idea about national security that isn't one that's favorable. And I think that's a very real concern that we should have in dismantling those perceptions, or at least creating a space for girls to talk about them. And then I think there's the actual tactical, how do you get from point A to point B? What does it look like if you're going to community college versus a four-year college? What types of courses do you take? Do I need certifications? How do I move from college into an internship or a early career entry point? I think there's a lot of work to be done sooner. And I say sooner because high schools already have the infrastructure in place with career counselors. And we do a lot of talking about careers at that level. I just think there needs to be more structure, specifically with cyber, where I think some of the schools we work with, again, in underserved communities, may not even have a computer science class. So you don't even have the opportunity to step into that space to kind of connect the dots for them, which is, again, not to be redundant, but that's why we always start by validating girls' experiences in security. If you have girls in communities, as we do, which are, diverse populations, but who have families of violence or are surrounded by gang violence, or who simply don't have positive, visible allies or role models, just creating that space for that training and engagement and empowerment, I think, is quite transformative. I don't think it stops there. I think there needs to be more committed efforts. But for us, those are some of the things that I think can be impediments to getting more girls and women into this field, and specifically underrepresented communities, girls of color.
I think that's great. And I think, both Ron and I would like to hear examples of success.
Yeah. So this is just a recent one that actually the Gula Tech grant will enable us to do. One of the things that we've always wanted to implement was a stipend program. We want, especially for girls of color, we want them to start valuing their time sooner because of the pay gap and the ways in which we know even women in more senior positions struggle to advocate for themselves financially. So we launched a stipend, a 5-day cyber training program with girls of color in the Chicago area. The school with which we've worked, which has a strong kind of equity focus, thought that we might have 20 girls sign up. We had 175 girls sign up. And the reason they signed up is because their families rely on them for income. And I think that's hard for some people to believe, but their families rely on their jobs. And so for them to be able to take time out of their work to learn about cybersecurity and to hear from some really awesome women in the space, it's offset by a modest stipend that enables them to do that. So that's a program that we'll have upcoming, and I hope you'll join us, even if it's virtually, just to say hi, because it really was because of the foundation grant we were able to do that. And similarly, we'll launch. So we had overflow even from that program into a fellows program that we will do our fellows program in the fall and winter, or fall and spring. That's a longer program. It's 6 months, also stipended. Girls from the summer program already waitlisted for the fellows program. So I think, again, it's getting out there. It's getting out there in the communities, which I can't stress enough, and really engaging one-on-one with girls and communities and schools and those trusted institutions that support their development, and just starting to talk to them about what this means. And so I think that can be quite transformative as well.
Do you have, without putting any of your young women on the spot, do you have any more personal stories about somebody who went through the program? I don't know, and they're working at the White House right now or something.
Yeah. I mean, we have quite a few pro girls who come through our program who just recently secured internships at Google and FireEye and Facebook and Department of Defense. Specifically, I think some of the more powerful narratives we have are around girls who were reticent to join the program because of what they thought national security is. And in fact, one of our young mentees, Hannah, who's a freshman in high school, came into a program, came into Girl Security and said, what I love about Girl Security is it has a social justice lean, which I thought was so fascinating because it's not something that we necessarily project, but it's creating the space for it. So she just recently interviewed Christy Abizaid, who's going to be, the lead at NCTC. And they had an hour and a half discussion about what national security means to Hannah, who's a freshman in high school, to Christy, who's served in the national security field for decades. And their discourse around what that looked like, Hannah was kind of saying, I'm worried about the economy. I'm worried about racial equity. I'm worried about all of these things. And Christy, who's going to be leading the National Counterterrorism Center, was able to say, that's a really great point. Here's my perspective on it. So I think from like the practical, securing internships and securing jobs and fellowships as well. We had one of our scholars who won a prize by Johns Hopkins University, to also just creating those points of contact for girls to talk with women in national security is pretty awesome, to be quite honest. And for women at the top to hear girls talk about their perception of national security, and maybe that can change something in the long term as well.
So this is kind of might be one of a tougher question, but we're really encouraging everybody to join this career for whether it's cybersecurity, national security. I think it's really important, but not everybody can be the quarterback.
Yeah.
So do you ever talk to a young woman and be like, you really should be a lawyer. You should not go into cybersecurity. You should be an economist, right? Computers and ones and zeros are not your thing. How hard is it having that conversation?
I don't have that conversation because I feel as though really our job is to kind of help direct and nudge and be supportive depending upon the path. Because again, even if they come through the program and maybe cyber's not their angle, there's going to be another program for them. And this is just an example. We're doing a program with the Naval Sea Cadets. So this is 90 girls, high school age, who presumably may pursue careers in the Navy. But the reason the partnership came about was because the Navy has a really hard time retaining women. And so we thought, well, even if these girls don't pursue this pathway, there's 1,000 other pathways that are also purpose driven, where you can take an oath to the Constitution or whatever else you feel the need to do. And so our job is to really open up that space and see those different pathways. That's not to say with some of our early career folks, I have said on occasion, you really should be a lawyer, or you really should be this, only because, I've been around the block and I can see what those skill sets mean. But also then how can you use that learning and education in this space that you are very passionate about? And there's a place for everyone: designers, marketing, comms, it's product development. I mean, there's so many different pathways that we need more diversity of thought in security broadly, I think.
Yeah, that's been a really big point, and I think DataCare really helps
Yes.
fill that and encourage more people to come in, because it's not coding, it's not ones and zeros. It's we need English majors who can speak better than I can to disseminate the information really technical into things people can understand. We need artists, because quite honestly, as a society, we're more used to being fed visuals than reading, it seems anymore. But you mentioned a couple of your partners. I mean, have you had other corporate partnerships or any other partnerships that have helped the organization and even into the future?
Yeah, so we've recently partnered with Microsoft Security, which will be a continuing partnership, which we're really excited about. We're partnering with Levi's Jeans in the fall to do a cyber simulation and impact on supply chain that will be open to girls. Really excited about that one because of the brand. Girls might not think of jeans as a point of entry for a cybersecurity career, but I think, as I know that the statistical point about reliance on private sector for critical infrastructure is up for debate, but I think generally even girls that go into a private sector or healthcare, whatever career they go into, understanding how national security decision making will potentially impact their professions, I think is quite important. So we are trying to partner mindfully in spaces where we know girls are looking and kind of interested, and hopefully we'll continue to have corporate partnerships, because they're certainly wonderful from a support perspective for a nonprofit, but we're aligned with so many different corporations that I'm hoping that some of these foundational ones will be a jumping off point for us.
And if if people want to engage girl security, I mean, obviously, I think you have a donation page and that kind of stuff. But like, what else are you looking for? Like, do you want more corporate sponsorships for internships? Is it regional?
Yeah.
Like, do you want them in the Midwest, like in that Chicago area? What can people do to help your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the capstone concept of providing girls an opportunity to problem solve corporations' issues, to spend a virtual week with them in the office and see what their pathways look like. I think local is better for the reasons you noted, because they can know that someone in their city or nearby town is in the space that they might be interested in. So certainly the existing corporate partnerships we have are oriented around skills-based learning. So what is this company looking for that you can learn right now or at least be exposed to? And then also the internship capstone, virtual training, a space where girls can come in and actually see what a company is doing on a particular issue, I think is really important. And it sets them up for success in the long term, because I do think those social networks, the importance of networking sooner is really crucial in the security space.
And how do you, I mean, with the large conversations you mentioned, supply chain, obviously that means something different to the cybersecurity professionals. China means something different. So how do you make policies towards China and Russia a personal thing for these girls so that they're not looking at it like it's somebody else's problem or it's something they don't have to worry about?
That's a really great question. And it was one of the questions we really grappled with when we started the program. We did a national security patch with the Girl Scouts Chicago, Greater Northwest Indiana. And that was oriented around election security, which of course provided an opportunity to talk about disinformation, and kind of the evolution of our national strategy and national security understanding over the last 100 years. And once we started to get into some of the specific cyber challenges around disinfo, looking at vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Actually, there was this new movie out. What's it called? The Mitchells versus the Machines. It's an awesome movie I recently watched with my kids, and in it there's essentially a cyber attack that uh, uh, prevents cars. It ruptures the digital networks upon which cars that have digital components rely. And so we talk about a lot of those things in the classroom from a practical perspective of, here are the ways in which these challenges might impact you. But probably more importantly is, here is the role that you can play, which is why I think disinfo and cyber provide such an opportunity for girls and all young people to really think about not only just national security, but the relationship between national security and our democracy, and the narrative around our adversaries, our quote unquote, our adversaries. And this is something we've been talking about a lot with China and Russia. We have girls in our classroom who are exchange students from China. So we really try to emphasize talking about government of China or government of Russia, because again, it's moving away from that kind of Cold War mentality, thinking about the United States in a global community that requires strategic partnerships and allies, and then also being able to disassociate what we mean when we talk about an adversary in the national security context, and then scaffolding that for girls who frankly might be afraid of having a conversation around things that are more accessible, like disinformation. And that's been quite effective for us. I do think, one of the concerns that was vocalized early on was a girl who at the time was reading competing news stories around Russian infiltration of voter registry systems, voter databases. And she said, if I've registered to vote, will I be targeted by Russia? And someone who I know thought that was funny, but I thought that's the perception of a young person who's coming up to vote, and think about what the implications of that might be if she represents a multitude of young people in her space who are registering to vote. So I think that's been our approach, is taking the personal security, connecting it to the national security, but then making those really important distinctions between adversary and impacts on our democracy as well.
And the crazy thing is that perception that might become a reality. Like, that didn't happen as far as I know, but public voter registrations are totally out there. You don't have your email and your Twitter account in there, but it's pretty easy to cross-reference those data.
Right. And free apps,
Yes.
what free really means when it comes to either TikTok or 23andMe or other areas that, you know, you're giving up your data, you need to know where that's going and how it could be used, not necessarily against you today, but what about weaponized against you tomorrow?
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about your background as a tee up to talk a little bit more about national security. So just going through LinkedIn, got a very impressive background, but I'm imagining a young girl watching this and wants to hear a more personal story. Not that we don't all want a great origin story, but LinkedIn, I think the first thing going back there was you worked at Georgetown University. You were a consultant for women in international security.
Yeah, I
What
was.
does that mean? What did you do?
So it was interesting. I was working at the national security think tank that I mentioned that I started out at in Chicago, and I was hired by Women in International Security to do a program on the intersection of national security and technology. And so I actually conceptualized the idea, again, going back to this observation of sitting in the room with the likes of Suzanne Spalding and others, knowing that we're just getting into this sticky domain. We have no legal frameworks, um, some precedent, but not a lot of groundwork that we can draw from. And so we conceptualized a first of its kind conference that looked at the intersection of national security and technology, and then also specifically looked at the gendered impacts of what that could look like in 20, 30, 50 years as well. That was a great experience.
And then you went on to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Yeah, so I was actually a junior fellow. Again, this all kind of overlapped over the course of my career as an analyst. And that was an interesting experience because, again, it was during the war in Iraq, and my brother was deployed at the time. My brother and I are very close. That was quite a profound experience for me and my family. And the conference was actually on post-war reconstruction, but we couldn't talk about Iraq. And so at one point, I sat there quite silently, and I understood why they didn't want to talk about it because it was such a controversial and difficult time. And someone called on me and just said, "Why are you not speaking? Why haven't you said anything so far?" And I just said, I don't understand why we can't talk about this active situation, especially when we're in the midst of a themed conference around Reconstruction. And I actually stayed up in my hotel room the next 2 days of the conference. I think I was probably having a bit of social anxiety, but it was this recognition that I'd come from the Midwest, kind of paid my way to attend this conference where I felt like I wanted to have a lot to say. And this is nothing to shame Carnegie. They're wonderful. It was just my experience. But it was this realization to me that people outside of Washington, D.C., especially if you have a personal experience, it's a very different perspective. And that was an important learning experience for me.
Excellent. And then you were a national security analyst for the National Strategy Forum.
Yeah, so the NSF was actually one of the oldest think tanks, national security think tanks in the country. It was founded in the late 70s by Donald Rumsfeld and a handful of Chicago businessmen. And they would sit around a table during lunch hours, all corporate folks, and brown bag lunches and talk about national security. So then the NSF kind of became its own think tank. And much of the work that we did was with the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security, which continues to be, one of the most important networks of national security lawyers in the country, and spent a lot of time doing a lot around cybersecurity, Patriot Act, due process and terrorism, looked at a lot of the legal issues. And that's where my interest in national security law really started to take hold. And then I went off to law school.
And then I think your last sort of think tank where you were a fellow at the Truman National Security Project. What was
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, Truman's great. It's so funny because Truman, I think, occurred around the time that I was having the idea for Girl Security. And in fact, when I was emailing my brother, the name that we started out with was like the Young Professionals Council on National Security, or something very bland. And then Truman actually came into existence. I think it was like 2004. And it was wonderful because it was a chapter-based organization, which meant that if you were in Chicago or not outside of the Beltway, you could actually participate in national security. And so I still think that Truman is one of the best, places around because they do that localized engagement, across the United States, which I think is really important.
It's a little interesting because, unfortunately, nobody's celebrating the pandemic. However, there
Yeah.
is a lot more work from home, work remote, working, acceptance that you don't necessarily need to be in the office. And
Yeah.
you've mentioned it a couple times, and we see it ourselves with respect to being in the DC area, that the mindset is so ingrained that it's hard to get people to move off of the way things have been done. But, you know, what about the idea of extending national security from that work with Washington, the centers, or pushing those centers out of Washington and getting them remote so that people who are in the more rural areas, the more Midwest, South, different thinking, not just completely thought in DC all the time, can participate, because that's that diversity of thought that everybody is working towards. So I mean, have you seen any, I guess, or thought about any potential movement in that direction?
I hope there is. I mean, I think with just, domestic violent extremism, cybersecurity, the nature of the need of state and local engagement, I think the threat landscape will hopefully, I don't want to say hopefully move us, but it will be a catalyst for more localized awareness and engagement around national security broadly. And I think just the fact that, we rely so heavily on the private sector with respect to cyber, there's just more opportunity to engage locally. And I also think with respect to our democracy, I mean, we are in a very tenuous place right now. There's going to be other elections coming up, and we're, not even just from a cybersecurity, critical infrastructure space, but I think just the nature, the state of where our country is, I think it would, the federal government, the national security apparatus, however one wants to phrase it, I think would benefit wholly and fundamentally for more localized engagement with communities around resilience and democracy and so forth.
So we're a big fan of that. So like with healthcare, you have a hospital, you have police
Yes.
department, you have incident responders, but then cybersecurity, none of that apparatus is there. Gas shortage, none of that apparatus is there. I mean, look how Texas struggled to kind of just answer the power. So understanding how things work and systems, we would love to see that as a national priority. We've touched on China, we've touched on cyber. Just if you were okay, I'm CNN reporter, Lauren. What are the top national security threats that the United States government and nation is facing? Go.
Oh my goodness. Well, I do think there are obviously the bigger ones like the nuclear threat, hypersonics, cyber, I think is of course, one of the most important. But I think from my perspective, after I had my career in national security, I took a massive detour where I was working on civil rights and in Chicago. And through that work, I learned a lot about urban development and sprawl. And I think we have some bigger challenges brewing around natural resources, water, loss of arable farmland. I think the economy, is one of our strongest national security strengths. And I worry about what the economy will look like between fractures in our democracy plus our inability to be more agile with how we train a future workforce, which is really why we focus really heavily on creating that multidisciplinary skill set. So I think we have the big issues, the ones folks talk a lot about, but I think education, economy, agile workforce are also things that Girl Security is looking at as well.
So about 5 years ago, the national school system, we added STEAM curriculum, right? Common
Yes.
Core, and great math, science, all that. We like STEAM. We like bringing some art into that because we think art is a lot of science. But if you had a chance to direct national education K through 12 policy, what would you change? What would you add to the curriculum?
I think I would take the pressure off of schools to teach STEM because it's detracted a lot of resources away from other things like critical thinking and ethics. So I think from my perspective, ethical decision making would be a core component of what I think is missing in school education. And it's a values-based idea that every single young person understands in a very holistic, fundamental way. So I would add ethics to the acronym as well.
Yeah, I working with one particular company, and the idea is to bring in cybersecurity, but not call it cyber.
Yeah.
And, with the pandemic, we've all learned how to wash our hands, not touch things, cover our mouth. So hygiene, just general hygiene, cyber hygiene, data, um, understanding, or even just risk behavior. Like, we have to understand that these kids are not going to follow our path because the ability and the exposure that they have is well beyond anything we did.
Is.
So we do not do a good job like we do with finance, how to balance your checkbook. Well, we need to teach them how to, manage their data online, how to protect. How does the internet work? It's not, again, this free is free, but it's not free, and what that really means. And so, risk behavior, digital citizenship, a lot of other areas. I agree. We definitely need to integrate without calling in
Well,
cyber,
and I
because
think
it chases people away.
it does. And from our perspective, one of the areas that we're going to be looking a lot at this fall through a symposium is the impact on cognition, right? You have girls and women. Some recent reports have been quite stunning. 14,000 girls surveyed, most of whom have been harassed online, most of whom have opted offline, with respect to civic and social engagement. I think the long-term picture is you have generations of young people who are socializing, learning, engaging online. The early science shows impacts on their brain matter. It's diminishing their emotional responses and potentially impacting their ability to recall information to make critical decisions. And so it begs the question of, is even what we're doing now going to best serve a generation of people whose brains may just be different than ours right now? And then if that is true, what interventions are required to make sure that we're doing what we can to support their development in the generation that they're coming up and not in the one that we think they should have?
So as you look forward to the next decade, let's say we're doing this interview in 2031, what are we going to be talking about? What are the struggles that we're going to have? What kind of things?
Accomplishments.
What accomplishments? Yes. Is it a dystopian future or is it a Disney future? And some of those Disney futures are kind of dystopian in nature. So where do you think we're going to be at?
I have concerns about disinformation. I do. I have a lot of concerns about um, adversaries' ability to capitalize on and weaponize narratives that are so entrenched in the fabric of our society. I have concerns about how the Constitution resonates to changing populations and generations, and how do we build kind of consensus or collaboration around our democratic ideals. Um, I I'm optimistic because I see a younger generation of people who, much to the chagrin of their elders, are more outspoken than I think prior generations have been, are more tech savvy, are more innately innovative than I would say I am, or most adults are. So I hope for a future that is not ravaged by climate change, that is not cyber insecure, that capitalizes on the power of young people, and that figures out how to navigate some really tricky social issues as well. I don't have any grand predictions, but
It's very safe. We mentioned we mentioned how the one young lady didn't want to register to vote because she might be targeted by the Russians. I could see that being a science fiction story. I can see that being reality, which is why we call it the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show.
uh,
And you already mentioned a story about, was it Mitch versus the machines?
it's the Mitchells versus the Machines. You have to check
Mitchell's
it
versus the
out.
machines.
It's a
I'll make
great.
sure to put that in the show notes. Any other type of fiction that you've either read, that your girls have read, that
Inspired.
that you think is telling?
It's interesting. When I was growing up, I was really weird. I used to read like Chicken Soup for the Soul, and I really loved people's personal stories. So for me, I've always been much more motivated, I guess, by empathy and wanting to understand the stories of individuals. I had no great heroines except Scarlet from G.I. Joe and Gem and the Holograms and She-Ra. Like those were my sheroes when I was young growing up. Um, but in fact, there are some kind of graphic novels and fiction that I know some of the girls have gotten into, but it's not as pervasive as I would think, in fact. And most of them, frankly, are mostly on Instagram and socializing on their apps. And I think more inspired by seeing other young people than necessarily some of the fictional characters. That's my observation when we talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've learned is women in research need to know why to do something
Yes. Yeah.
before doing the what. And so, I mean, even your own stories, were like, well, why are we not talking about this, or why are we doing it this way? And I really do think that challenging status quo and inviting more women, you're going to get more why, and hopefully plow through that way. But how do you see in national security that we balance the people wanting to be famous and be on Instagram and be the one other people are watching, with this idea that national security is not something that is fun to watch, fun to do, or in general been told not to talk about it?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite quotes is actually from Middlemarch. And essentially the quote itself is the idea that uh, so many people contribute to kind of the world in which we know it now and often rest in unvisited tombs. So this idea that you may go your whole life contributing to the greater good, but never receive recognition to it. And it's something my brother wrote in a piece when he came back from Iraq, this idea that democracy isn't bestowed from one generation to the next, that it actually requires the engagement of all of us. And so I have to say, I don't find girls in our program looking for the limelight. They're very realistic about their goals. They know that they might be working behind the scenes, but I think they're purpose driven. And so I think if that's what's leading you, um, you're going to find a space that is rewarding. Not to say that there aren't ebbs and flows to each of our individual experiences, but I think that purpose part is what makes girls and women so important in national security, because oftentimes they're not looking for the limelight. They're really just, they want a reason to say, I'm going to, find purpose in my job, or if I'm a mother, this is why I'm going to leave my children to go do this job that I really want to do. I think that purpose piece is really central to engaging girls and women.
So it's funny, Hollywood has you can use words like, woke or whatever, but they're definitely creating content to be more appealing to a diverse group. I'm like, remake War Games, put
Yeah,
a Black female lead in that, and make it as exciting as it was for Top Gun for people who wanted to become Navy pilots.
totally.
Why can't we appeal to a generation? And in that one story, you could probably touch on China, national security,
Supply chain.
the allure, or it's not just men in hoodies. Like the girl with the dragon tattoo did not help the image of hackers. Even though that was probably the most realistic hacking I've seen in the movie. I'd love to see the War Games. Any
I think it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we submitted a first episode of a cartoon to a contest called Spyflix, and it's a cartoon, the story of four girls who come to this girl security summer camp, and they each find their superpower. In this series, it's intelligence, so it's OSINT, human, SIGINT, Matin. So they're able to kind of step in and figure out how they can use this strength that they already have to, quote unquote, save the world. And I do think Hollywood has an important role to play in this space. But I think, too, they need, and some of the conversations we've had, they need coaching around what that actually looks like. What do women in powerful positions look like when they're not hypersexualized? Or what does it look like when the women who are actually saving the world will say, well, it wasn't just me, it was a group of women. So how do you create an exciting collaborative film on national security? I totally think the potential is there and exciting, but it might take us a while to get to that place.
And there's some great female characters out there.
Yes,
Like
yeah.
the woman who's the CIA, I don't know, director or whatever in the Born Identity series.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a great thing, but it's kind of hard to kind of show that to young women. Say, hey, here's a role model you could go do. You know, it's going to get more like mainstream type stuff.
And again, missing the mark. I think our industry tries to or says you're all on your own, that it's not collaborative. I mean, talk about an industry that's most collaborative, because the expertise that is needed is so broad that there's, it's really impossible for one person to be an expert in everything, that we have to work all together. So yeah, ideas and collaborative demonstration, I think, would really help other people understand you're not in a hoodie by
No.
yourself in your basement doing anything. It's very much a lot more collaborative.
And there were the recent ads by CIA and the Army that got some backlash from public leaders and online. And, we issued a statement on that just to say that, first of all, regardless of whether or not you like the new ads, these institutions are trying to appeal to a diversity of people, which I can only commend. We can only commend. But I think in the narrative that washed out of the reaction was this idea that people associate a fictionalized character like Jason Bourne, right, with the reference that someone cited, as kind of the epitome of what we think should embody national security intelligence, when in fact, when you talk to all of these wonderful women who have left their homes with their children and are making, not to say that men aren't involved in that, but I'm saying there's a whole narrative of people that are not represented in that fictionalized scenario. And I think it just shows, and we have experienced this in girl security, there are still very strong societal norms around girls and women in an active security role, certainly as it relates to the military. But I think generally, because of a lack of understanding, it goes into other areas as well.
Oh, our camera just shut off.
Oh no.
We're going to switch to the FaceTime camera here. Hey, we're going to finish this episode because I don't know why my camera just shut off, but that's technology for you.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, actually we were about to wrap up. So one of the things I'd like to do, especially for people who work with young people, in your case, young women, can you take a moment, look into the camera, hopefully your camera doesn't fail like ours.
Yes.
And just talk to somebody who's considering joining cybersecurity, considering joining national security. What can you say to inspire them to join up?
I guess what I would say is you belong in this space. National security, cybersecurity are the most consequential fields of our time, and we need diversity of thought. We need diversity of lived experiences. And so I would say to any girls and young women, you belong in this space. Your experiences, good and bad, matter. And there is a community of women waiting for you to help you along if this is a career path that you're considering.
That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. So you might see that on Instagram or in a highlight reel, but I think it's very inspiring. So congratulations again.
Yes.
on
Thank
what you
you so
are.
much.
Continue to kick butt and get the young girls into national security and cybersecurity.
And we're very excited to participate in the
Yeah.
programs that you're doing. Definitely reach out. We, as much as we can do to cheer and make any type of impact and enhancement and blow out your message and mission is great. So definitely let us know.
Appreciate that. I can't thank Ghoul Attack Foundation and the both of you enough. It's it's something I will be saying for the next 1,000 years. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, Lauren Buita, CEO, founder of Girl Security, thank you so much for coming on the Ghoul Attack Cyber Fiction Show.
How do people get a hold of her?
We can ask that too. So as we sign out, how do people get a hold of you?
Well, you can go to girlsecurity.org and you can find all of us on our website. You can find me on LinkedIn, and we're always up to talk to new people and engage with new audiences. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I don't know, how else do you sign out?
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction
This is-
Morning Talk Show Hour.
This is Cindy and Ron Gula signing off. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks so much.